Hello everyone, here today I have Chapter 18 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. As Ellis had warned them, the ford across the river was chest deep and the current was strong. Horace and Gillen reined in to study the crossing. So far, there was no sign that the foxes had followed them. After their demoralizing defeat earlier, they would be in no hurry to get close to those deadly archers again. "We should get half the archers across first, to set up a defensive line on the far bank, and cover the rest of the force while they cross," Gillen said after a few minutes. The river was just over 100 meters wide at this point, so the bank they were on would be well within range. "Good thinking," said Horace. "We don't want them catching us while we're floundering around mid-river." "I didn't see any archers among them. Did you?" Gillen shook his head. "If they had any, they would have used them," he said. He called to the commander of the archers. "Nestor, get half your men paired up with the cavalry, and set up a line on the far bank." The senior archer nodded, and touched his forehead with his knuckles, then began calling orders to his men, so that half of them slipped down from the backs of the horses they had been riding. They handed the reins of the unsaddled horses to the cavalrymen they were paired with, and stood beside the mounted men, gripping the harness leathers tightly. They handed their bows up to the riders, who slung them across their shoulders. "Why not let them ride across?" Horace asked. But Gillen shook his head. "They can ride, but they're not experts, and it'll be tricky controlling a horse in that current. Better to let your men keep the horses in place, so they can provide support for the archers walking beside them." The first of the cavalrymen were urging their horses forward into the river, the archers clinging to the downstream side, where the horses would provide a bulwark against the current. They surged out into the stream, the water rising rapidly until it was lapping at the riders' knees. The archers, clinging desperately to the harnesses, pushed on with them, nearly chin-deep in the river. Two of them lost their footing, and their legs floated up to the surface, but they maintained their grip on the stirrup leathers and, with their mounted companions leaning down to heave them upright, regained their feet once more. Gillen watched until they were halfway across the river. Then, satisfied that the plan was working, he turned his attention back to the tree line, several hundred meters away. He walked to where the second group of archers were standing ready, facing the trees, bows in hand. "Any sign of them?" he asked the second in command of the force. The man shook his head. "Not so far, Ranger." The terrain here was similar to the spot where they had first engaged the foxes. Several hundred meters of open grassy plain before the thickly wooded forest began again. "Call out as soon as you see them," Gillen said. The man nodded, his eyes fixed on the shadows beneath the trees. Behind him, Gillen heard a whip cracking, accompanied by loud splashes and shouts of encouragement. He turned to see the supply cart as it entered the water, with the 5 archers who couldn't ride still clinging to it. It lurched sideways under the initial thrust of the current. Then the wagoner whipped up his horses, and they bent to the traces, pulling it straight. The wagon rocked and shuddered as it coped with the uneven river bottom, and the force of the water shoving against it. For a moment, Gillen thought it might tip over, and he opened his mouth to shout a warning. But it was solidly built, with a low center of gravity, and it regained its balance, gathering speed as the horses pulling it grew in confidence. The wagon lurched violently as one wheel sank into a hole in the river bed. One of the archers was nearly dislodged from his precarious perch, saved only by a quick hand thrown out by one of his companions, who dragged him back to safety. Gillen heard a quick peal of laughter from the men on the cart, including the one who had nearly fallen. He nodded to himself. Morale was good if they could laugh about the near mishaps, he thought. He touched Blaze's side with his heels, and trotted up to rein in beside Horace, who was watching the progress of the small force across the river. "What have you got in mind once we're across?" he asked. The tall warrior grinned ruefully at him. "Well, there's no further need to track down those 6 foxes we've been following," he said. "We've found the main force we've been looking for." "And there are more of them than we bargained for," Gillen said. "We'll need to find shelter, somewhere we can set up a good defensive position." I was thinking we should head for that old hill fort we saw on the map. It's only 3 or 4 kilometers downstream from here." Gillen nodded agreement. "Thought that might be what you had in mind," he said. "They're nearly across," he added, indicating the men in the river. The first 3 horsemen were urging the horses up the shallow slope on the far bank, the archers releasing their hold on the horses' harnesses and walking unsteadily away from them. The cavalrymen who had assisted them handed their bows back, and the archers sat on the grass, wringing out their sodden breeches and jackets. As he watched, the remaining archers waded clear of the river. The supply cart plunged up the bank, the archers riding it, jumping clear, and running to reform with their comrades. "Ranger!" It was the archer Gillen had spoken to who was calling. Gillen looked at him now, and saw the man pointing to the tree line in the distance. There was movement there as men began to emerge from the forest. "Looks like our friends have arrived," he said. Forrest looked to the far side of the river, where the archers who had already crossed were still recovering from the effort of wading chest deep in the fast-running current, and from the soaking they had received. "Be a couple of minutes before they're ready," he said. Gillen pursed his lips. His friend was right. "The lads on this side will have to discourage the foxes," he said. He slipped down from Blaze's saddle. "Think I'll give them a hand." He strode across the grass to join the small band of archers. There were 8 of them in the line. 7 had crossed with the cavalry, and 5 had ridden on the supply cart. Horace turned to the waiting cavalrymen. "Form up on the river bank," he said. "Be ready to help the archers when they make a run for it." In the distance he could hear orders being shouted. The foxes were beginning to form up, a single extended line this time. "Archers, stand to," Gillen ordered quietly. The bowmen, who had been lounging on the grass, rose to their feet to form a line, spaced 2 meters apart, standing side on, each with his right hand on an arrow in his belt quiver, his left holding the bow loosely, in a relaxed position. There was no sign of nervousness or anxiety among them. They were confident in their own ability, and knew they were about to deal a deadly rebuff to the advancing troops. From the far side of the river a piercing whistle cut the air. Horace turned, and saw that the 12 archers who had already crossed were now formed up as well. Their commander waved his bow over his head to signify that they were ready. "Nestor has his men in position," Horace called to Gillen. The ranger acknowledged the information with a wave of his hand. His eyes were still fixed on the approaching troops, now striding with growing confidence, since the expected hail of arrows had not materialized. Their spirits were further bolstered as they saw that the force of archers facing them had been halved. 8 bowmen, they thought, couldn't do much to stop them. They were about to find out how wrong they were. An officer rode among the advancing infantry, leaning down to drive them forward with blows from the flat of his sword. The men recoiled from him, but he was keeping them moving, not allowing them to shirk or hesitate. Gillen allowed himself a humorless smile. "Never a good idea to draw attention to yourself in battle," he said, "particularly when there are archers around." He raised his voice so the line of archers could hear him. "All right, lads, I'm going to take down that nuisance on the bay horse. When I do, that's your signal to start. Shoot fast, but aim your shots. Ready?" There was a feral growl from the waiting archers in response. 8 hands drew 8 arrows from their quivers, and knocked them ready on the bows. Gillen nodded approvingly. Their discipline was excellent, he thought. Then the enemy line passed a point he had already selected. He knocked an arrow to his own string, raised his bow, sighted and shot in one smooth movement, barely seeming to aim. The arrow flew in a whimpering parabola, then struck home in the center of the rider's chest, hurling him backward over the horse's rump and leaving him lying still on the grass. The men around him parted, looking fearfully at him as he lay there. Nobody had seen the arrow coming. Nobody had seen any of the men facing them shoot. Then the first flight of arrows from the near river bank hit them, slamming into shields and helmets and exposed arms and legs. One man fell, 2 others staggered back under the impact. And the second flight of arrows hit them, causing more damage, creating more gaps in the advancing line. And then a new rain of arrows was upon them, as Nestor and his men on the far bank added their contribution to the mayhem. Arrows plunged down from a higher angle, an almost ceaseless shower of hardened steel points that slashed through chainmail, tore holes in leather and metal breastplates, and sent men crashing to the ground on all sides. One sergeant looked along the line, seeing the neatly ordered rank being disrupted and torn apart. They still had 70 meters to go before they reached the small force of archers facing them. At this rate, few of them would make it. As he had the thought, the man next to him fell with an arrow through the top of his leather helmet. He glanced back to see their commander, safe and secure in the tree line, screaming at his men. "It's easy for you," he muttered. "You're not out here." He stopped and held his sword over his head, waving it in a circle in an unmistakable gesture, then letting the point descend and indicate the ground behind them. "Fall back!" he yelled, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "Fall back! Close up and fall back!" Better to have them retreat now, while they still had some vestige of discipline, than wait till the arrows had decimated them and destroyed their will to fight. Gillen saw the lone figure calling orders. As he watched, he saw the line close up, sealing the gaps torn by his archer's arrows, and he raised his own bow to shoot the sergeant who was restoring some sense of discipline to their attackers. Then he stayed his hand. The man was ordering the foxes back, ordering them to retreat. He might be saving some of their lives by keeping them in formation, but it made no sense to cut him down now. He was doing the work of the heirloom force. The line of attacking infantry began to withdraw, leaving a score of huddled shapes on the grass behind them. Once they began to retreat, Gillen knew they wouldn't attack again in a hurry. "Cease shooting," he called, and the last few arrows hissed away. Nestor's men had already stopped. The fox line was out of range now. "Back to the river bank," he ordered. "Partner up and get across the river." All right, that's going to be it for Chapter 18. Thank you all for joining me. I'll see you all next time in Chapter 19. God bless, and have a good one.